The streets of New York have always been a battleground, but for the Gambino crime family, it was more of a slaughterhouse, where the weak were gutted and only the ruthless survived. Brace yourselves as we begin the expedition into the bloody legacy of 5 of the most vicious mobsters to ever enforce the law of the Gambino Empire. Men who lived and died by a blood oath, leaving bodies in their wake like breadcrumbs for the next hit. Kicking off this brutal lineup is Joseph Joe Piney Armone, a man whose quiet demeanor masked a heart as black as midnight. Armone played the long game, escalating from street vendor shakedowns to orchestrating the murder of a mafia boss, all while dodging bullets meant for his head. His rise stained in the blood of friends and foes. Prepare yourself for an unflinching look at the dark, violent lives of the Gambino family's deadliest mobsters. Their tales are brutal, their ends inevitable, and their legacies soaked in carnage. From a young age, he'd followed in the footfalls of his older brother, Stephen Armone, into the dark, serpentine world of the Gambino crime family. But where Stephen's violence had been blunt and efficient, Joe's rose to a craft, a meticulous art of survival, where every betrayal had a cost, and that cost was often paid in lead. His first taste of crime came in a winter of desperation. It was the early 1950s, and New York was a city of dirty snow and dirty money. Joe Piney had carved out a name extorting the tree vendors lining Manhattan streets during the holiday season, but his true business came in the sticky allure of heroin smuggling. Tied deep into the French Connection, Armone became one of the major earners in the family, working under the watchful eye of Joseph Biondo. His association with Biondo and the drug empire brought not just wealth but power, earning him a coveted seat at the table where kings are made or murdered. But even the highest seats are unstable. On a fog-drenched morning in 1957, whispers of betrayal and power plays swirled around Armone like the smoke curling from his cigarette. Biondo had chosen him, Armone, alongside a few others, to execute Albert Anastasia, the Mad Hatter himself. But before Armone could fulfill his part of the plan, federal agents swept in. A narcotics charge had tied the young gangster to an intricate web of dope and deceit. In the span of hours, his plot against Anastasia had unraveled, and instead of pulling the trigger, he found himself behind bars, watching from a cell as another hitman claimed the kill and the glory. While inside the pen, Anastasia was taken out by a different crew of killers from Joe Gallo's gang. The cold irony wasn't lost on him. Behind the unforgiving steel bars, the world of New York organized crime shifted, yet Joe Piney endured. 15 years for drug smuggling, the government said. To Armone, it was a countdown, not a sentence. But there was no mercy in the life he'd chosen. While imprisoned, his associates ran drugs through the veins of the city, heroin pumping through New York streets like blood through a pulsing artery. In 1964, he began his second ascent to power when Armone narrowly escaped death. He sat in the Reno bar, a place that reeked of stale liquor and the stink of failure, when a gunman approached and fired 5 bullets into his body at point-blank range. The assailant fled, leaving Armone crumpled in a pool of his own blood. But Joe Piney wasn't easy to kill. He clung to life, spent months in the hospital, while Biondo, ever the puppet master, sat at his bedside as if daring the Grim Reaper to take him. A man who survives a close brush with death isn't the same on the other side. Armone became harder, colder, his loyalty to the family unshakable, though it was now a shield as much as a bond. His reputation, nearly destroyed in the prison stint, was reforged in blood and bullets. By 1985, after years of playing his hand wisely, Joe Piney was back in the game, recruited by John Gotti himself to overthrow the great Paul Castellano. It wasn't just a power play, it was a massacre waiting to happen. Armone had never thought much of Castellano, too corporate, too greedy, too cautious. It was Gotti who saw the world for what it was, a world ruled not by suits and numbers but by fear, the unspoken language of power. For Armone, this was a chance to reclaim what he lost, one last grab for glory. The plan was elegant in its violence. The Christmas lights still twinkled in Manhattan when Castellano and his underboss Bilotti were gunned down outside Sparks Steakhouse. Armone's hand might not have been on the trigger, but he had helped set the stage. With his orders executed precisely, Armone found himself back in good standings. Gotti seized control of the family, and Armone was promoted to underboss, a kingmaker at last. The streets had whispered his name in fear before, but now they would chant it. In Florida, where Armone oversaw the Gambino activities, his reign was ruthless. The money flowed, the rackets hummed, and the enemies fell. For a moment it seemed like the darkness would hold him up forever, suspending him in a shadowy kingdom of wealth and power. But shadows are unstable, and soon they began to shatter in the light. It was December 22nd, 1987. His final fall came not in a blaze of bullets, but in the sterile courtroom light of justice. The charges were heavy racketeering, bribery and extortion. Armone, the man who had outlived gunmen and gangsters, who had navigated power plays as deftly as a chess master, now found himself caught by the one enemy he could never kill: time. The sentencing loomed, but worse than the years he faced was the offer laid before him. Freedom could be his for a price, not cash, but something far more costly. They wanted him to renounce his life, to admit in public what had been kept secret for decades, his role in the mafia, the family. He would have to break the oath he'd sworn with blood. Gotti's voice echoed in his mind. There would be no plea deals, no confessions, even if it cost Joe Piney everything. His silence would be his final act of loyalty. In February 1988, the judge delivered a 15-year sentence, a death sentence for a man his age. Behind bars, Armone watched the days stretch into years. The cells, the bars, the faces of his enemies, they all blurred into one long, aching wait. Time passed slowly, inexorably. On February 23, 1992, the old gangster slipped away in a prison infirmary, his body failing where bullets once could not. Joseph Armone's legacy was written in blood, both spilled and spared. His rise to power had been forged through treachery, violence and loyalty. And when his final call came, it was not with the dramatic crack of a gunshot, but the slow, creeping silence of a heart that simply stopped. When it comes to the mafia, the only guarantee is that power has a price. And for Anthony the Genius Megal, that price was always steep. A cunning mastermind who once ruled the streets of Connecticut with an iron grip, Megal's rise through the ranks of the Gambino crime family was as relentless as it was ruthless. From the smoky backrooms of strip clubs to the cold halls of federal prison, Megal was a man who knew how to play the long game. Anthony Megal's story is one of greed, violence, and a heart that gave out before the streets could take him. Let's dive into the shadowy world of the genius and see how his criminal empire crumbled into ashes. Anthony, the Genius Megale's life reads like a blueprint for the American dream gone astray, a blueprint smeared with blood and greed. Born in the old country Italy, Megal's life would veer far from the warmth of olive groves and cobbled streets. His path would take him through the underbelly of America, where shadows cling to men like cheap suits and no one dies peacefully in their sleep. By the time he reached Connecticut, Megal was already soaked in the ethos of the mafia: family loyalty, secrecy, and above all, power by any means necessary. His nickname, the Genius, wasn't a nod to academic prowess. It was a tribute to his sharp mind for crime, a lethal asset in the world of the Gambino family. In the early 2000s, Megal's rise was nothing short of explosive. Stamford, Connecticut became his dominion, and he ruled it with a quiet menace. Harry Oil Can Farrington, a strip club owner who thought he had already seen the worst of the underworld, had no idea what was coming. The patriarchal crime family had been bleeding Farrington dry for years, collecting monthly protection payments like clockwork. But in 2002, Megal muscled into the scene, cutting through the ranks of New England's most feared mobsters like a knife through veal. He confronted the patriarchal mobsters, snarling that Stamford was his turf now. And just like that, Farrington's monthly extortion tab was passed on to Megal, at an inflated rate no less. The price tag wasn't the only thing that went up. Megal imposed a new layer of fear, taunting Farrington with whispers of broken bones and burning clubs should his payments ever arrive late. The tension crackled like static in every encounter, Farrington's hands trembling as he handed over the cash, the cold metal of a hidden FBI wire biting into his skin. The illusion of safety shattered for Farrington. He realized there were no rules here, no bottom to the pit of Megal's greed. But this was the mafia, and violence simmered just below the surface. Megal was building a legacy, but it was made of glass, and every crack in the foundation hinted at what would come. The FBI was closing in, and Farrington's tapes painted a damning picture. The noose tightens. For 2 years, Farrington wore that wire, each encounter inching him closer to madness, while the FBI meticulously documented every whispered threat, every hint of violence. Miguel, in his arrogance, continued his extortion like clockwork. $2,000 a month plus the obligatory $3,000 Christmas bonus. But greed, as it often does, blinded him to the inevitable fall. By 2004, federal agents had gathered enough evidence to drag the genius into the harsh light of day. The indictment dropped like an anvil, 38 counts of extortion, each one driving a deeper nail into Miguel's coffin. His empire crumbled, but his pride remained intact. Miguel's guilty plea in 2005 was a calculated move, an attempt to mitigate the damage. The sentence came swift and brutal, 86 months in a federal penitentiary. The streets he once ruled would now forget his name as new sharks circled the blood in the water. But even behind bars, Miguel clung to his power, quietly plotting his next move. His ability to play the long game had always been his greatest strength. But time, as Miguel would discover, has a way of unraveling even the most carefully laid plans. When Miguel was finally released from prison in December 2014, the world outside had changed. The Mafia wasn't the omnipresent force it once was, its grip loosened by years of law enforcement pressure and internal decay. But Miguel, ever the strategist, wasn't finished yet. He returned to his old stomping grounds with a renewed hunger. The genius hadn't lost his taste for power, and whispers began to circulate that the old Capo regime was ready to rebuild. Stamford had grown cold in his absence, but there were still some embers left in the ash. Miguel met with old contacts, feeling out opportunities to resurrect his criminal network. He was careful this time, more cautious, more deliberate. Yet, beneath the surface, the same hunger for control burned, and it wasn't long before the old patterns resurfaced. The extortions, the threats, they began to ripple out once more like shockwaves from a distant earthquake. But this time, the world would not allow Miguel the luxury of a slow rebuild. His body, worn down by years of prison life and the constant stress of staying ahead of both the law and his enemies, began to betray him. On a humid July morning in 2015, Miguel's heart gave its final protest. There was no bullet, no car bomb, no dramatic hit in the street. Instead, it was the mundane brutality of a heart attack that took him down, striking like a thief in the night as he sat in Stamford Hospital. In the end, the man who had survived the violent world of organized crime for decades met his end in a sterile, fluorescent-lit room surrounded by beeping machines instead of gunfire. Yet the fall had been long in the making. Miguel's death marked not just the end of a man, but the end of an era. His vision of reviving his corner of the Gambino empire had flickered and died, snuffed out before it could even catch flame. Those who had feared him, who had paid him for protection that never truly existed, now walked the streets without the shadow of Anthony the Genius Miguel looming over them. But like all mobsters, his story wasn't without its irony. Miguel had spent years avoiding a violent end, the one that inevitably catches up with most men in his line of work. Instead, his heart, his very own body, betrayed him, pulling him into a darkness he could never escape, no matter how smart he thought he was.
In the brutal world of Cosa Nostra, few names carry the weight of Michael "Mikey" Scars DeLeonardo. A man who wore his wounds like badges of honor, Mikey didn't just flirt with death, he courted it, earning his way up the ranks of the Gambino crime family with blood on his hands and betrayal in his veins. With every step deeper into the underworld, the body stacked higher, and the lines between loyalty and treachery blurred into a sickening haze. But in the end, it wasn't a rival hitman that brought him down. It was his own words. This is the story of a mafia powerhouse whose life of violence culminated in the ultimate betrayal, leaving over 80 mobsters in the cold grip of the law, and the mafia shattered into pieces. Welcome to the world of Mikey Scars, where blood loyalty and backstabbing go hand in hand, and every scar tells a tale of survival or vengeance. Michael "Mikey" Scars DeLeonardo's story began in the narrow streets of Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, where the shadows of his future loomed over him long before he even realized it. Born on June 18, 1955, to second-generation Sicilian immigrants, DeLeonardo grew up in a world where loyalty, bloodlines, and violence intertwined like veins in the underbelly of New York City. His father, a professional bowler, and his mother, a humble seamstress, couldn't shelter him from the underworld lurking around every corner. The neighborhood was a powder keg of mobsters, and Michael had a front-row seat. But it wasn't the ordinary scuffles that shaped him. It was the savage bite of a dog when he was just 10 years old, leaving a scar across his face that would brand him forever as Mikey Scars. As he grew older, the streets of Brooklyn became his real classroom. By the time DiLeonardo reached high school, the men he admired weren't the local shop owners or teachers. They were the Gambino associates lurking in the shadows, handing out money and commands with the same cold detachment. His recruitment began quietly at first, just a few errands for some pocket cash. Smash a few windows, rough up the unlucky fools who crossed the wrong men. But soon, these petty tasks morphed into more. He became someone reliable in the Mafia's eyes, someone who could deliver fear in a way that kept tongues silent and debts paid. By 1980, his presence grew large enough to warrant his own social club, a mere block away from the Veterans and Friends Club, the dark heart of Gambino activity. The scent of cigar smoke and whiskey mingled with whispers of illicit deals as DiLeonardo began dabbling in bookmaking and loan sharking, staking his claim in the underworld. His rise seemed assured, his destiny cemented when, in 1985, he married into mob royalty, Antoinette Tony Marie Fapiano, cousin of none other than Frank DeCicco, the ruthless underboss who wielded power like a maniacal dictator. But as quickly as the flames of success burned bright, so too came the smothering blanket of betrayal. July 16, 1981, painted the streets of Brooklyn with the blood of his brother Robert DiLeonardo, gunned down in an internal Colombo conflict. Mikey Scars burned with rage, the kind that twists a man's insides. But orders came down from Paul Castellano himself, hands off. The murder had nothing to do with their family. DiLeonardo had to swallow his pride, bury his vengeance, and continue to play the part of the obedient soldier. In 1985, Castellano fell in a hail of bullets outside Sparks Steakhouse, opening the doors for John Gotti to rise to power. With Frank DeCicco as the new underboss, DiLeonardo's stars seemed to align once more. Reporting to Gotti's Ravenite social club 3 to 4 times a week, he cemented his ties to the most feared family in New York. Yet, even in the heights of power, death lingered nearby. On a fateful April day in 1986, DeCicco was obliterated by a car bomb, a ravaged reminder that in this life, no one was safe. DiLeonardo stood with Gravano, Garofalo, and Joe DeCicco, helpless as they tried to pull their friend's mangled remains from the wreckage. The smell of burning metal and flesh would haunt him for years, a grisly omen of how close to death he always danced. But DiLeonardo knew how to adapt. Survival meant leaning into the power vacuum left behind. By 1988, he was formally inducted into the Gambino family, his blood oath binding him tighter to the darkness. From there, his rise was meteoric. When Gotti was finally taken down in 1992, thanks to Gravano's backstabbing, DiLeonardo was promoted to captain, overseeing the family's construction and trucking rackets with a ruthlessness that earned him a fortune. Scaramix concrete on Staten Island, pump and dump scams on Wall Street. His fingers were in every pie. Yet, the higher you climb, the harder the fall. By 2000, federal eyes were closing in. The government moved in on racketeering, extortion, and money laundering charges, sweeping DiLeonardo into a legal web. But even as the heat bore down on him, luck still seemed to play in his favor. Acquitted in 2001 on charges tied to the Gold Club in Atlanta, he dodged a bullet. Yet, inside, he felt the crumbling foundation of his once impenetrable world. The family, his supposed blood, had begun turning on him. They accused him of stealing, of robbing the family blind. As they cut him off financially, Mikey Scars felt the sting of betrayal once again. His breaking point came quietly, in the loneliness of a prison cell, waiting for trial after trial. Shelved by his own, the cold realization settled in. There was no loyalty in the mob, only survival. That truth pushed him over the edge. The whispers of his son's disappointment, the constant fear of life behind bars, and the betrayal of those he once called brothers led to a dark moment in 2002. A suicide attempt left him more scarred than the dog ever had. It wasn't the physical wounds that hurt now, it was the weight of his life's choices pressing down on him like a vice. When DiLeonardo decided to cooperate with the FBI, he wasn't just flipping on the mob. He was rewriting his legacy. He testified a record 15 times, more than any other made man, sending over 80 of his former allies to prison. He stood in courtrooms, recounting the sinister subversions and backroom deals that had once defined his world. Peter Gotti, Louis Villario, Junior Gotti, Persico, all fell because Mikey Scars had finally chosen to rise for himself, not the family. His final fall came not in violence, but in the quiet of witness protection. Stripped of power, his Staten Island mansion now a memory, DiLeonardo walked through the world as a ghost of his former self. He's no longer feared, no longer revered, but his scars, both on his face and his soul, remain. Today, Mikey Scars is continuing to tell his tales and treachery on his YouTube channel called No Excuses.
When Frankie Locascio stepped into the deadly dance of the mafia, he knew the rules, blood in, blood out. But even for a man who clawed his way to consigliere of the Gambino crime family, death lurked around every corner. Frankie's story isn't just one of mafia power and brutality. It's the tale of a man marked for death by the same organization he once ruled. A man who swore revenge and dared to defy a death sentence that no one thought he'd live to tell about. Let's peel back the layers of deception, fury and gruesome retribution in the life of Frank Locascio, a man whose final fall proves that in the mafia, loyalty is just another word for a loaded gun. Frankie Locaccio's rise through the Gambino crime family began quietly, almost imperceptibly, like a shadow growing longer as the daylight faded. Born to Sicilian immigrants, his roots in the mafia were more than just cultural, they were inevitable. His entry into the underworld was unassuming. A mere bookmaker and loan shark in the Bronx during the 1950s, but that's how all blood-stained legacies begin, with simple transactions and seemingly minor infractions that soon spiral into more violent, tangled webs. His first taste of true power came with the whispered word that Paul Castellano had been gunned down in the street. The bullets that tore through Castellano's flesh in front of Sparks' steakhouse reverberated through the entire underworld, reshuffling loyalties and aspirations. As John Gotti ascended to the throne, his appetite for power insatiable, Frankie Lock slipped into his inner circle. The street dealer had become a consigliere, no longer just a servant of the family, but now a man privy to its secrets, a guiding hand in its darkest affairs. He stood close to Gotti, his face unreadable, while beneath his calm demeanor, the weight of the family's sins threatened to crush him. But power, once tasted, is intoxicating, and Frankie's thirst grew. He had spent decades building his reputation through quiet deals and the careful elimination of anyone foolish enough to cross him. And yet here he was, forced to endure Gotti's unpredictable wrath. The arrest in 1990 should have been a death knell, a full stop on a life of crime. Instead, it set off a fuse. Dragged into a jail cell with Gotti and Sammy the Bull Gravano, Locaccio's loyalty to Gotti faltered. A petty incident involving a stolen orange, something that would have been laughable outside those walls, festered. Gotti humiliated him, berating him loudly in front of the other inmates, his voice dripping with venom, every insult an assault on Frankie's pride. As Gotti sneered, the rise in Locaccio's life took its first fall. He was no longer just a consigliere, he was a man on the edge, his fury simmering beneath his stoic mask, the cold resolve of a killer reawakened. That night, in the silence of the prison cell, Frankie Lock made a vow to Gravano. His voice was low, his words laced with a bitterness he could barely contain. "The minute I get out," he whispered through clenched teeth, "I'm killing this." The promise wasn't an empty threat. It was an oath, one that carried the full weight of mafia honor and betrayal. The tension built like a volcano, the temperature rising with every moment Locaccio spent in Gotti's shadow. They would be acquitted, Locaccio told Gravano. They would walk free, and then, at the victory party, Gotti would never see it coming. Frankie would pull the trigger himself. It would be a clean hit, precise, a brutal punctuation to years of being Gotti's loyal lackey. The imagined rise brought a brief flicker of hope, but in the mafia, even hope comes with bloodshed, and more often than not, it drowns in the violence. Locaccio's plan unraveled when Gravano betrayed them both, testifying against Gotti and Locaccio in exchange for a deal. The courtroom became a theatre of despair as Locaccio, expressionless, listened to Gravano detail their crimes. His fate was sealed. On April 2nd, 1992, the conviction came down like a sledgehammer: racketeering, conspiracy, life in prison without parole. But Frankie Lock, despite the chains now binding him, stood tall in that moment. When the judge asked for his final words, he delivered a chilling epitaph: "I'm innocent." I am guilty, though, of being a good friend to John Gotti. And if there were more men like John Gotti, we would have a better country. It was a bitter rise of defiance, a final refusal to bend fully to the system that had brought him to ruin. But life inside Marion Penitentiary would deliver the final fall. The Mafia may have controlled the streets, but in prison, Gotti's reach extended into even darker corners. Gotti, furious over Locasio's betrayal, reached out to the Aryan Brotherhood. He wanted Frankie dead. The Aryans, white supremacists notorious for murder for hire, accepted the contract. It was only a matter of time before Locasio's life would end in the same blood-soaked manner as so many others in their world. Locasio knew it. He could feel the death sentence in the cold, watchful eyes of the other inmates. The last rise, his survival, was reduced to mere minutes, each one a stolen reprieve. Though the hit never came to fruition, the shadow of death followed Locasio for years. In prison, every whisper, every sideways glance could mean the end. Then, in 2021, a final unanticipated assassin struck. The virus we can't talk about swept through the prison, leaving bodies in its wake. Locasio, frail and nearing 90, contracted the disease but miraculously survived. It wasn't the bullet that took him down in the end, but time, a slow, agonizing decline into illness and obscurity. His death in a prison infirmary was an anticlimax, the final fall in a life punctuated by violence, power and betrayal. The legacy of Frankie Locasio, once consigliere to the Gambino crime family, wasn't one of triumph, but of survival. Brief rises of power amid a descent into betrayal and ruin. When it comes to the dark underworld of organized crime, few names carry the same weight as Giovanni John Gambino. This wasn't just another wise guy. He was the heartbeat of a powerful transatlantic mafia network, a man who bridged two worlds, Sicily and New York, spinning webs of heroin trafficking, money laundering and murder. From the bloody streets of Palermo to the shadowy corners of Brooklyn, Gambino's rise wasn't just meteoric, it was ruthless, leaving a trail of bodies and fortunes in his wake. Today, we unravel the twisted legacy of John Gambino, a man whose name struck fear into enemies and sometimes even friends. On the shadowed streets of Brooklyn, whispers of Giovanni John Gambino began to spread like smoke in the early 1970s. His Sicilian roots ran deep, his bloodline tainted with the legacy of crime, stretching from the ancient cobblestones of Palermo to the concrete jungles of New York. Born into a world where loyalty was paramount and betrayal lethal, John was a man molded by his past, his rise within the Gambino crime family as inevitable as a storm brewing on the horizon. He wasn't just another soldier in the mob's ranks, he was a Sicilian mafioso, a captain with a reputation that sent tremors through the underworld. As a member of the Gambino family's Cherry Hill faction, John, along with his brothers Rosario and Giuseppe, stood at the nexus of a vast drug empire with heroin at its blackened heart. Their base of operations in New Jersey seemed innocuous enough, but the quiet town masked the violent tendrils of the Gambino-Inzerillo heroin pipeline, stretching across the Atlantic like the web of some monstrous spider. The family's cafe, Valentino's, sat on 18th Avenue in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, a seemingly mundane establishment that hosted a clientele whose mere existence could freeze blood. The first rise came in the early 1980s as John solidified his position in the family. Together with his Sicilian counterparts, men like Salvatore Incerillo, they moved thousands of pounds of heroin through New York's veins, refining it in secret labs in Sicily and smuggling it into the United States. The world they inhabited was painted in shades of grey, men in dark suits holding quiet conversations, shipments moved under the cover of night. Giovanni Falcone, an Italian magistrate whose very name would become synonymous with the fight against the Mafia, began tracing the tangled threads of their operations, estimating that the network smuggled $600 million worth of heroin annually. Gambino's name surfaced again and again, like the bloated corpse of a long-forgotten victim floating to the surface. But as with all things in the mob, success was a double-edged blade. In 1980, cracks began to form in the empire Gambino had helped to build. Michele Sindona, an Italian banker who handled the Mafia's finances, became a liability. The sharp scent of desperation clung to Sindona as his financial misdeeds threatened to expose not only himself, but the entire heroin trafficking syndicate. Gambino played his part in staging Sindona's disappearance, a poorly conceived fake kidnapping that sent ripples through both the criminal underworld and Italy's political elite. Their plan unraveled faster than they could adjust, and soon Sindona's trail led to federal indictments, and the Gambino Inzerillo network was thrust into the harsh light of a criminal investigation. His fall came with a crushing inevitability. By the mid-1980s, law enforcement on both sides of the Atlantic were closing in. Operation Iron Tower became the hammer that struck, with coordinated raids across Italy and the United States. On a cold December night in 1988, Cafe Valentino became the scene of a grand performance, a dance of sorts, where the unwitting were trapped under the heavy boot of the law. 100 mafiosi gathered to hear the latest crooner from Italy, their laughter filling the room. But as the last note drifted into silence, federal agents swarmed the cafe, their guns glinting under the dim lights. The lead agent took the stage with dark humor, announcing, "This is your last dance." Some men laughed, thinking it a joke. Others tried to flee, but were caught. In the back, John Gambino watched the chaos, his sharp eyes betraying nothing. This was not his night. The feds didn't have enough evidence to charge him yet. But law enforcement's patience with John Gambino was not endless. In 1990, the net finally closed around him. Arrested on January 4th, he was soon entangled in a superseding indictment for narcotics and racketeering charges. Released on an exorbitant bond signed by his wife Vittoria and son Tommy, the Gambino patriarch seemed untouchable. He had been acquitted before, and the government had failed to extradite him to Italy. But this time, the noose tightened as notorious informants such as Sammy the Bull Gravano and Francesco Marino Manoia, men who had once dined with him, laughed with him, trusted him, turned state's evidence. The trial was set. In February 1993, Gambino's world became a courtroom battleground. Gravano, the betrayer who had turned on his mentor Gotti, painted the Gambinos as ruthless drug traffickers. Manoia, now living under federal protection, testified in chilling detail about the heroin shipments he had personally overseen, shipments inspected by none other than John Gambino himself. The prosecution painted him as the mastermind of a heroin empire, a figure of quiet menace who had reigned over his empire for 2 decades. But the defense countered, attacking the credibility of Gravano and Manoia as killers and liars, claiming the heart of their accusations were built on sand. The trial ended in a mistrial, the jury unable to reach a unanimous verdict. John Gambino, who had sat impassively through it all, perhaps felt the stirrings of triumph once again. But it was short-lived. In 1994, faced with overwhelming evidence and the relentless pursuit of justice, Gambino finally pleaded guilty to charges of racketeering in exchange for a lighter sentence. The deal was a calculated move, a way to minimize damage and preserve what remained of his crumbling empire. Prison was not kind to him. Behind bars, John suffered a stroke, heart attacks, and underwent multiple surgeries. Yet even in his weakened state, his legend grew. In 2005, after 15 years of confinement, he emerged from prison, his once imposing figure now confined to a wheelchair. But even then, the shadow of his past would not leave him. Italian authorities, still eager to make him pay for his crimes, sought his extradition once again. In a stunning legal twist, a federal judge overruled the decision, declaring that Gambino could not be tried twice for the same offences. Once again, John had slipped through their fingers. The third and final fall was quiet. By 2008, Gambino was part of a leadership panel running the Gambino family. But it was a shell of its former self. Reduced to a gang of only 200 men, the family's power had waned. By then, the younger generation, including his wife's nephew, Frank Calli, was rising to prominence. John Gambino, once a titan of the heroin trade, faded into obscurity. On November 16, 2017, death came for him not with the roar of gunfire or the cold steel of betrayal, but with a whimper. Natural causes took him in the end. But in the shadows, his name still lingers, a reminder of a life drenched in blood, power, and the unrelenting march of time.